I was saying about how the secret to high performance is hiding in plain sight. And I thought, let's start with that. How is it hiding in plain sight?
What I was talking about in that opening paragraph um, is in the 1990s, starting in the 1990s, but really the 1990s, if you know anything about action and adventure sports in the 1990s, and you go back to the start of the 1990s, and action adventure sports are not mainstream at all, right? These are punk rock subcultures that are, sort of popping up in these like couple of locations. There's Chamonix, right, in Europe. There's Whistler, Blackcomb, British Columbia in Canada. Squaw Valley, or what's now Palisades, Tahoe in California, Jackson Hole, Wyoming, a couple other spots. You've got these weird punk rock communities. But what starts coming out of these action sports communities is unprecedented in the history of the world. More so-called impossible feats, never been done, never going to be done, got done in 10 years. We now talk about the 90s as the era of impossible. And the examples are like, pick an action sport, and it's not just that the world records got broken, it's they were broken and broken again and broken again and broken again and broken again. Like there's a quote in Rise, I think it's Jeremy Jones, the snowboarder, who said, yeah, it is Jeremy Jones, and he was talking about what it was like to be in Alaska on some of the early heli trips in the 90s, when like literally, you would wake up in the morning and there were rules in action sports, like don't do this or you'll die. And they were changing on a literally like hourly basis. It lasted, some of it's still going on today, but we had never seen anything like it. And, I think the example I give to sort of comparables opening the book is sort of, one of them is, surfing is the classic example, right? This is a 1,000-year-old sport. And from the 4th century AD, when it's invented, to 1996, biggest wave anybody's ever surfed is 25 feet. And above that, it's impossible. There are physics papers actually written about how it's impossible for a surfer paddling on his belly to catch a wave that's over 25 feet. There's other physics papers that say the human body cannot survive the forces of and so forth. And today, surfers are, they're paddling into waves that are over 80 feet tall. Some people paddle into a couple that are over 100 feet tall, and they're towing into waves. I think the world record is now over 118 feet tall. These are skyscrapers. They're towing into skyscrapers, right? And we went from like a house to an apartment complex to not a skyscraper, but to a 100-story building, in a very short period of time, or 100-foot building in a very short period of time. And nothing like that has ever happened before. So the book looks at, where did this come from? Why did it happen? I think the cat is sort of out of the bag, now in terms of like what's happened. But that's what's at the heart of the book. The secret for all this performance is the optimal state of performance, consciousness that we talk about as flow, scientific term. And it, more specifically refers to any of those in the zone moments of total absorption, complete concentration, when you get so focused on the task at hand and everything else starts to disappear, melt away. And all aspects of performance, both mental and physical, tend to go through the roof. So that's flow in a colloquial nutshell, right? Psychologists define it by 6 core characteristics. The work I do at the Flow Research Collective, where we look at the neurobiology, the brain mechanisms that underpin it, we define flow by like 11 different changes in the brain and our physiology as well. So the definition, I was colloquial. We could talk for the next 2 hours about what the term actually means, but it is, and it's not just action sport athletes, of course. It is anytime the impossible becomes possible. This could be in science and technology and art, doesn't matter, in business. Whenever that happens, we see people utilizing their consciousness known as flow. There's no other way to do it. Humans are designed for peak performance, and flow is how we do it, right? Evolution shaped every human can get into flow, right? Most mammals can actually get into flow. And what's interesting about your career is, I would argue that you're probably wrong on 2 fronts and you're probably right on 1 front. So let's go back to your career for half a second. One, there are a bunch of different neurochemicals that show up in flow. People like different neurochemicals in their body, just like people like different substances in the real world, right? They're doing the same thing. And there are certain athletes, and you see this a lot, like the mountain bike community is really famous for this. They're the people who are real heavy endurance athletes tend to ride endorphins into flow. And what's interesting is we used to think endorphins were the big explanation for flow. And now they're actually like, they're just a minor part of the story. And they tend to show up very late, right, in the kind of chain of events but for some people who come in, there's, by the way, people who come in like you, there's also all this research out of the sadomasochistic community, right? The S&M community. There's a masochism-based flow state, right? Like a pain-based flow state.
I did my research, man. I did my research.
Okay. But that's, I mean, like endurance athletes often set the same high, right? You're doing the same things, but that's not everybody. Who ride that particular pathway in. That may just be you. But the other thing is that the two things that are worth pointing out. The one is you were probably really great at getting into a state of microflow. So the flow is like any emotion, anger, right? You're a little irked, you're homicidally murderous, it's still anger, right? Flow's the same thing. There's a microflow state. This is where I said flow is defined psychologically by a bunch of core characteristics. Complete concentration on the task at hand, this merger of action awareness, the vanishing of self and self-consciousness. Time passes strangely. We don't feel peak performance, even though we're performing at our best. We feel a sense of control, like, oh, I can control things I can't normally control, right? This is basketball players talking about, I'm in the zone of the hoop, looks like as big as a hula hoop, right? And I can't miss, that kind of thing. And then the experience itself, the fancy word is autotelic. It just means joyous, ecstatic. If an experience produces flow, we want more of it. So there's microflow, right? This is when those things show up and they're like dialed down to one or two. So this is like, let's take it out of sport for a second. This is like you go to work, you sit down to write a quickie email to a colleague, right? You get so sucked into what you're doing that an hour goes by and you didn't notice. And maybe your sense of self and self-consciousness didn't totally vanish completely. The bodily awareness was gone because when you pop back into your head, you're like, oh crap, I got to go to the bathroom, right? This happens to all of us all day long. We do this all the time at work. So that's microflow. It's pretty hard to be a serious athlete and not be able to put yourself into microflow during practice, because otherwise you just can't sustain it, right? As you know, like practice with, if you're just practicing and there's no flow and you're just drawing on grit to do it, sooner or later you burn out. Like you drop out of that sport. You cannot progress. That's a hard limit because grit's a very limited resource. And when we talk about really like sustained grit over time, it's always in combination with flow for that very reason. Flow in a sense redeems and justifies the grit. And so grit without flow is burnout. That's literally a recipe for burnout at work. And as an athlete, it doesn't really matter. So oftentimes what happens in the competitive moment of the game is you have bits of flow, but because of the nature of competition, it can just as easily drive you out of flow. This is not to say that you can't perform at your best, because this is one of the cool things flow does. It sort of shows you what's possible when you're at your very best. But once you see what's possible, you start being able to reproduce those same skill levels without flow, right? This is sort of how we level up.
If what you've heard on Flow Research Collective Radio has been helpful, please consider doing us a solid and leaving us a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you are listening to this. Reviews help us connect to a wider audience so we can get these peak performance principles out to more people.